Alrighty, the revolution begins. After the causes of the American Revolutionary War, remember all the way back to the French and Indian War, the British government after that time wanted the American colonists to pay off that war debt in the Stamp Act and the Townsend Acts. American colonists refused, saying no taxation without representation. The colonists instituted a boycott against British-made goods, and that boycott was successful for several of those tax measures, even though it eventually led to violence in 1770 in the Boston Massacre. Now, eventually, the British, in order to try to save the British East India Tea Company from going broke, passed the Tea Act of 1773. But many colonists were afraid that that Tea Act was just a conspiracy to basically make them pay taxes eventually on everything. But the king certainly did not help that tea tax when he basically made Parliament add a 1-cent tax on the tea, simply so the king could say, see, we taxed you, which of course just gave those colonists more reason to shout no taxation without representation. And of course, the Boston Tea Party was seen by the British government as not just an assault on the government, but also an assault on private businesses, the British East India Tea Company, and therefore ordered the port of Boston to be closed, sent some people to England for trial, basically canceled the Massachusetts Charter, and basically sent in a governor or a dictator, so to speak, a general, to order people in Massachusetts around to make sure the British laws were obeyed. That General Thomas Gage, certainly when he got in power, did not want his army to shoot down civilians in the street, but he had orders, and to try to stop a revolution from happening, he decided to try to take the colonists' gunpowder away. Several attempts failed, and eventually the last attempt at Lexington and Concord would actually lead to the war itself. So if you remember that last one, the Middlesex Alarm, the battles of Lexington and Concord, occurred in April of 1775. General Gage was going to send 700 redcoats to Concord. He was going to capture a lot of gunpowder and weapons there. But unfortunately for General Gage, Paul Revere found out about that and then put their plans, the colonists put their plans into effect, even though supposedly people in Boston were sort of blockaded. The tall building of the church could be seen for many miles, especially across to the city of Charleston, where Sons of Liberty members saw the lights at the church and realized that the British were basically sending over a military force from Boston to the Charleston shore, and then we're going to march to Concord. By that time, Paul Revere had was rowed over in his boat. The Sons of Liberty gave him a horse, and off Paul Revere rode. At the very same time, another rider, William Dawes, was also leaving Boston by the neck. They arrived about the same time at Lexington to warn Sam Adams and John Hancock to clear out. Sam Adams being the head of the Sons of Liberty, John Hancock being the rich guy who sort of funded the Sons of Liberty. As those people were clearing out, they joined with another writer, Dr. Prescott, and tried to go warn Concord. But along the way, Paul Revere was captured. Although Dr. Prescott did get away to warn Concord, Paul Revere was captured. But then he sort of talked his way out of captivity, headed back to Lexington, basically just in time to see the skirmish there where British soldiers pulled up and see the colonial militia. They exchanged gunfire, leaving about 8 of the Lexington militia dead. The 700 British soldiers then continued on to Concord. People of Concord being warned the British soldiers were coming and basically removed most of the stuff from town, north of town. Meanwhile, the British soldiers looked for that stuff, threw some things in the pond or lake, and sent another British soldier detachment to the North Bridge. That North Bridge, the militia had seen part of their town being burned, and so that militia came down from the hills, and a firefight erupted at the North Bridge. The British troops retreated back to Concord, and then those troops started marching back to Boston by way of Lexington. Unfortunately, along the way for them, they were basically fired upon by all directions from the increasing number of colonial militia that was quickly organizing to fight them. Fortunately for the British troops, General Gage had sent out reinforcements, 1,000 men under Lord Percy. They arrived at Lexington, were able to rescue the other 700 men. Unfortunately, they did not have many supplies or enough supplies as far as bullets were concerned, since some of their supply wagons had been captured leaving Boston. Nevertheless, the 1,700-man British Army force then moved its way eventually to Charleston, where the guns of the British fleet could protect it against an American advance, and the British troops were safe at that point. But of course, hundreds of them were wounded and killed, and many of those troops spent the night being rowed back to Boston for medical care by British Army doctors. And so the battles of Lexington and Concord marked the start of the Revolutionary War. So by the end of that second day, about 20,000 of the colonial militia were outside of Boston. Of course, Boston was defended by 4,000 British soldiers. So basically, the British soldiers were now sort of stuck in Boston waiting for reinforcements, while the 20,000 militia sort of surrounded them on the land side, and those militia continued their training, of course, hoping the British troops would come out for a fight. As the war starts, very quick snapshot of the populations. In 1776, Great Britain had a population of about 2.5 million. I'm sorry, excuse me, 11 million. Great Britain had a population of 11 million. Of those, 2.5 million were in the Americas. So Great Britain had a large manpower pool. It had a lot of people. Of course, the 2.5 million citizens here in the colonies, of those about 500,000 were slaves. And of course, if you're a slave, you certainly want your freedom, and you might even use the war as a way to get your freedom, either by fighting for the side that you think is going to win, or maybe even trying to run away during the war. Of course, you also had a free African American population, about 25,000 people in the colonies as well, as the war starts. So it looks like the advantage is on the English side, especially when you look at the armies involved. Great Britain had an army, a standing army of 45,000 troops. The colonies had a standing army, an army ready to go of 0 troops. The British Navy had 600 warships. The American Navy was non-existent. It had 0 ships. So that does not look good for the American side, does it? No. On the other hand, there were some troubling items as far as the British government was concerned. First of all, of their army of 45,000 men, only 11,000 were actually in Great Britain, sort of ready to go. Another 10,000 were guarding Ireland, were in Ireland. The British had taken over Ireland, and so that population was very rebellious as well. So it's not like they could withdraw the 10,000 men from Ireland and send them anywhere, or else Ireland would rebel. There were another 5,000 men in Gibraltar, which, as you come into the Mediterranean Sea, it's on the Spanish side, which is one reason the British could not move those 5,000 men. Otherwise, the Spanish would take over that colony. They had about 7,000 cavalry and 3,000 artillery. And in the Americas, they had about 10,000 men. But those men were spread out all the way from Canada in the north to the Caribbean islands in the south. So not all of those men were available to put down an uprising, as it were. And certainly the British Navy had 600 warships, but the British Navy also had worldwide military commitments, just like it did with its army. So the British Navy had to keep enough ships in England to prevent an invasion by the French or the Spanish or somebody else. They had to have Navy ships for their colonies, not just in America, but their colonies in the Caribbean, their colonies basically in India, their colonies in Asia. And all those Navy warships just weren't ready to go. They had 600, but many were laid up, many were without crews. So it would take a lot of time to get all those ships back into operation. Same way with the Army, although technically they had 11,000 men in Great Britain ready to go, they couldn't leave all of Great Britain undefended, otherwise some enemy might attack them. And they also had to have troops ready to defend their colonies in other parts of the world. Now, so the British had a bigger army and navy, that's for sure. They had a bigger army and navy. But again, they were defending worldwide commitments. As you see on the map, everything red is the British Empire at the time, although you have to be careful. So even though all of Australia is colored in red, actually there were very few British citizens there. They were mostly along the east coast of Australia. But of course, the map, for some reason, they claimed the entire area, although they didn't actually have people there. Same way with India, they claimed all of India, even though they had basically just a few outposts along the coast of India. But nevertheless, they had worldwide commitments, especially on many islands as well. Now, from the American side, you might not have any standing army ready to go, but you do have your militia troops, and you have a lot of militia troops, because those are basically all able-bodied men from basically 18 to 50. And as we've already seen, some of those older men could also fight past 50. So you do have enough people to form armies. And of course, not all of your militia will be forming armies, because some of them have to stay and plant crops and grow food to feed those people that are in the armies. You also, in America, don't have any standing navy. You don't have any navy warships, but you do have a lot of cargo ships. New England has been building a lot of ships to get past what the British called the Navigation Acts, which said everything had to be shipped to England on British ships. But since New England was part of the British Empire, if you built your ship in Massachusetts, that counted as a British ship. So the people in New England had a lot of shipbuilding ability, and so to convert a merchant ship to a warship didn't require very much at the time. It required you put on a few cannons, and so that was easily doable, especially if you had the cannons. So although it looks like the Americans have almost zero chance, in reality, of course, they do have military troops, and you have to remember that they're 3,500 miles away from Britain. They're at least a month sailing time, sometimes 2 months sailing times away from Britain. And every soldier Britain sends over has to be supplied by England. As we'll see, eventually, even though not everybody in America is pro-British, I'm sorry, not everybody in America is anti-British either, the people that are anti-British government, they're enough so that even if you're pro-British, you're not going to give your stuff to the British Army, which means the British Army has to be supplied by ship from 3,500 miles away. And of course, all those British cargo ships are going to have to be guarded by the British Navy as well. So there are multiple problems, including how, as the war starts, how do you conquer a continent with an army? Even if you have 45,000 men, how do you conquer a continent with that? So there are problems on both sides as far as military. One of the first things the Americans run across is, however, they're lacking military supplies. They're lacking those cannons to put on ships. They're lacking cannons to bombard the British soldiers in Boston. They're lacking gunpowder. They're lacking weapons. And so Benedict Arnold, a Connecticut store owner who's in the militia, comes up with an idea to go to Fort Ticonderoga and get those supplies from the British fort. Fort Ticonderoga is located in upstate New York. I don't know if you can see that, but right above Fort Ticonderoga, there's a lake called Lake Champlain, not Champagne, but Champlain. And basically, you can just sail down from Canada on that lake. Then you can basically, just a few miles walking distance is another river they call the Hudson River, and you can take that river all the way to New York. So during the French and Indian War, Fort Ticonderoga was a very important British fort. It prevented the French from invading the British colonies. And it had been a very large fort and a very important fort. There it is, still there today. So Benedict Arnold, by the way, his father had been pretty rich. Well, his grandfather had been pretty rich, but his father basically spent all the money gambling and on booze. And so Benedict Arnold had promised his family basically he'd earn the money back. And he was doing a pretty good job. He was a successful store owner in Connecticut. He owned part share of a ship that was trading. And then the war breaks out, and Benedict Arnold says, I need to serve my country. I need to serve my colony at least. And I have to fight for my rights as Englishman. So he decides to lead a detachment up to Fort Ticonderoga and take it over, which, by the way, he does. After supplying his militia units with horses and uniforms out of his own pocket, out of his own money, he leads the force up there. When he arrives at the fort, it's very early morning. He basically has to bang on the door of the commanding officer to waken the commanding officer up, and the commanding officer has no idea that basically Great Britain and the colonies are sort of at war. Of course, there's no declared war yet, but he hasn't even heard of Lexington and Concord. So it's very easy to take over that fort, and once the fort is taken over, Benedict Arnold and some other troops, including a guy named Frank Knox, decide to try to bring these cannons back to Boston. And that means they're going to have to drag them overland. There's no real road to Fort Ticonderoga, so you're going to basically have to sort of create your own road. And it's getting towards winter months, which means you're going to be dragging these heavy cannons through rain and snow and mud and all that sort of stuff. So that's going to take several months. But nevertheless, at least the colonies have secured a supply of gunpowder and some weapons and even cannons with the attack on Fort Ticonderoga. About this time, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in September 1775. Remember, the first meeting, the First Continental Congress met a year before in 1774 in Philadelphia. And at that time, they basically said, to do away with the Intolerable Acts, let's boycott, but just in case we have to fight for our rights as Englishmen, let's get our militias ready. And then they said, okay, we're done. We'll meet back here in September 1775. Well, it was September 1775. And so they met back again. Basically 12 of the 13 colonies were represented, Georgia not. Then, of course, needed, obviously, if they were going to fight, and it looked more and more like they were going to fight, although they were still hopeful for a peaceful solution. But if they were going to fight, they were going to need a commander. Now, interesting at the time, as the delegates discussed this commander, the richest man in the colonies, John Hancock, was in the room. And of course, John Hancock had escaped Lexington thanks to Paul Revere and William Dawes. And John Hancock had smuggled in a lot of stuff from the colonies. He was the richest man in the colonies. He had supplied the Sons of Liberty with money. And so as the delegates, the politicians talked about who they wanted for a commander, one of these politicians got up and started talking about this wonderful man who'd given so much, and this wonderful man who was a great leader, and this wonderful man, and the rich guy believed, hey, they're talking about me. That must be me they're talking about. That's awesome. John Hancock says, I'm going to be the general. And then the politician stops and says, so, gentlemen, I would like to suggest George Washington as the commander of our army. And it said that John Hancock's face fell like a rock. He was not too pleased. But George Washington was a good choice. You might not think George Washington is a good choice. You might remember his military record, which was 0-2. His first adventure at Fort Duquesne, where he built Fort Necessity, he had to surrender to the French. And then he helped lead the attack on Fort Duquesne with General Braddock. And of course, he had to lead a second great retreat. So his military record was 0-2. Just the man who you want to lead your army. I'm sure if you play a sport, if you play football or something like that, I'm sure you'd be really enthusiastic if you got all your equipment, you practice, and they called a team meeting and said, hey, our old coach is retiring, or whatever, but we have a brand new coach with for us. Okay, coach, come on over. Yeah, tell the team about all your great victories. And the coach says, victories? Well, I've never won a game. Of course, you as a player might be thinking, is there another team I can be on, please? So obviously George Washington is not picked because of his great military ability. So why is he picked? He's from Virginia. He represents the upper class from Virginia. Virginia had not gotten in on the war yet. All the trouble so far had been in Massachusetts, had been in battles of Lexington and Concord, for example, had been in Massachusetts. So the politicians wanted a united effort. They just didn't want one section of the country having to fight the British government. They wanted all sections of the country to join together and fight the British government. So basically, the Northerners were saying, hey, well, look, we have this great army in the north made of our own militia groups. Let's appoint a Southern guy to command a Northern army. And that gave Southerners a stake in the war, first of all, because if George Washington had lost the war, for a long time after that, people would say, huh, those Southerners, they can't fight. Just look what happened when Washington got elected to the army. He lost the war. But of course, if George Washington helps wins the war, for many years, those Southerners are being said, oh, look at us, we're great military geniuses. So in many ways, this was a political move. Little did they know, little did those politicians know that they were making the best possible choice. I think that's the consensus of almost every historian that I've ever read or heard, that basically George Washington was the best choice for this job. And I wouldn't say the only choice, because historians hate to use those exclusive terms, but I think most historians would agree that George Washington was the best choice, and that will certainly show in the later stages of the war, when other people might have given up. With many losses, George Washington never gave up. So they picked a good guy to lead the army. And once he was picked, he immediately got on a horse and raced to Lexington and Concord to whip that militia and basically create a new army, a continental army, an army of all 13 colonies. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress also sent a message to the King of England called the Olive Branch Petition. An olive branch symbolizes peace. So this was a peace message to the king. And basically the Olive Branch Petition said, look, King, your government has really angered us, but we're still British citizens, and we still hope to get back together. So if you could just take your mean old army away, we can figure out some way of reconciling, some way of getting back together. So if you just sort of admit that you're wrong, King, and if you just sort of take your army away, I will still sort of be with Britain, and we can work something out. Little did they know that at the very same time they were sending over a peace message, the King of England, George III, was gearing for war. He was actually contacting foreign governments looking for army troops. Raising army troops in Britain was very expensive because basically once you raised, especially the officers, once you raised an army with officers, you basically had to give them a retirement plan, which was very costly. And of course, the more troops you sent from England, the more discontent in England they're going to be. The more you ship the sons away from their mothers and fathers in England, the more the mothers and fathers are going to get mad at the king. So the king's looking for soldiers, but he's not necessarily looking for British soldiers. In fact, eventually he settles on German soldiers. Although there was no one Germany back then, there were many Germanies. They weren't united yet. And one of those places was a place called Hesse-Kassel. And Hesse-Kassel was great for providing soldiers. The king of Hesse-Kassel, he took you when you were young and made you join his army. And they gave you a sort of a rudimentary education, sort of an elementary education, but then taught you army life. They taught you how to fight very, very well. But Hesse-Kassel really had no enemies. So the king of Hesse-Kassel, the king of this German principality, wasn't concerned about defending his throne or defending his land. He was going to sell you as the troops to somebody else. He sold his armies to different countries. That's how the king of Hesse-Kassel made his money. And now the king of Hesse-Kassel was going to sell his army to England to come to America to fight. About 30,000 members of German population eventually were summoned, enslaved, if you like that word, to join his army and sent to America to fight. So at the very same time, the king was also asking his parliament to send more military troops to America. He was also asking about the possibility of British Navy ships bombarding the coast, that is basically British Navy ships coming up to a city and blowing it up from the water. And so as the Americans were extending a hand of peace, the king was busy looking for a sword to chop off that hand. And naturally, when the Americans find out, that's going to anger them even more. Because in some cases, this is like a psychological effect. Because the king has been your father figure. He is the father figure in England. By the 1770s, he's no longer making the laws. He's basically enforcing laws. So most of the colonists here in America blame Parliament for all these laws. They blame Parliament for the Boston Massacre. They blame Parliament for the tax laws. They blame Parliament for sending over troops. So they're very hopeful for the king is on their side. So again, in many ways, they sort of view the king as a father figure. So it's even worse when they learn what happens. I mean, how would you react if you come home today or go home and before you even go in the door, two men come out and say, "Excuse me, we're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and we have your parents downtown in custody." And of course, you're going, "What? What did they do?" And the nice FBI men then inform them that when you were born, your parents had taken a life insurance policy out. Never since then, they've been taking more and more life insurance policies out. And now they had several $1 million worth on your life, and they were going to kill you to collect the life insurance policy. Of course, you would not believe them. You'd be looking for the hidden camera. You'd be looking for someone with their little phone that was trying to film you and get a good laugh off of everything. But what if it was true? I mean, how would that psychologically scar you for life, knowing what your parents had done? And so in many ways, when the king turns against them, many American colonists, they're also psychologically scarred. That is, they're very, very, very angry and are willing to commit to fighting against overwhelming odds against this king. Meanwhile, in order to gain even more support, the colonists have a plan. Capture Canada. The people that had been New France, who are now Canada under English rule. So the thinking went two ways. First of all, if we capture Canada, we can use it as a bargaining chip. Hey, king, look, we captured your Canada. Oh, you want Canada back? No problem. You take your troops away, you take your laws away, we'll give you Canada back. But even if the king didn't agree to that, think of all that nice new land you could have. Plus, think about maybe all those people who would join with you to fight the British government, because now you're fighting the British government, and many of those people, remember, in Quebec are former French people who never quite liked the British government in the first place. So if you capture Canada, it's a win-win situation for the Americans. So the Americans devise an attack on Quebec. Of course, you have to capture Quebec to capture all of Canada. And basically the plan was twofold. One American army would leave and basically go up to Montreal, Royal Mountain is the definition, another town in Canada. They would capture that under the command of General Montgomery. Then they would move to Quebec. Meanwhile, another group of Americans under the command of Benedict Arnold, the same Benedict Arnold with the Fort Ticonderoga move, would go basically up some rivers in what we now know as Maine, and eventually arrive at Quebec at the same time as General Montgomery. And then you would have, I don't know, about 4,000 men surrounding this city, and you'd break in and capture Quebec, especially when at the time, probably there were no more than 500 British troops in Canada, in Quebec to defend it. So those would be good odds. So the invasion of Canada begins. Unfortunately, the plan to capture Montreal is not very good. By the time they capture it, Montgomery has the American commander Montgomery has a lot of casualties. He only has about 1,000 men left, so he starts marching them toward Quebec. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold gets his couple thousand men together. They arrive basically at Newport, but they find that the ships that are supposed to sail upriver they don't have yet, and so basically he has to march upriver. He can't just float upriver. And the winter comes early that year, so as the days go on, more and more men sort of drop and die. So eventually, by the time the Americans arrive in Canada, they have about 2,000 men. Meanwhile, the Canadian militia has arrived, and now inside Quebec, they have about 1,500 men. So the Americans outnumber the ones in Quebec, but winter set in, and most of these Americans that are attacking Quebec are militiamen, and they've signed on for 90 days. That is, Once 90 days is up, they get to go home. And basically, most of their enlistments are up on the first of the year. The first of the year is 1776, January 1st, 1776. And so when they arrive, when the Americans arrive in late December 1775, they only have a few days to plan an attack. And remember, of course, Quebec is high on a bluff overlooking the river. So, of course, they send some American units to the back, just like the British general did. But, of course, naturally, the defenders of Quebec already know that plan. They've already prepared for that. So this is how sort of Quebec looks today, which means, of course, not only are you attacking from the rear, the Americans are going to basically come in what's called the lower city and then work their way up. They basically have to go up ladders. They have to climb up the wall to get to the fortress up there. Which is going to, of course, be a tough job. Nevertheless, the Americans attack. Unfortunately, Montgomery is basically shot and killed in his attack, and his men sort of become dispirited. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold, leading his men through town, basically breaks in one gate. He gets in the lower city, but when he tries to get in the upper city, he is basically injured in a cannon blast. His leg is injured, and the troops have to drag him away before he dies. So the Americans do break into Quebec, but unfortunately they don't get very far and have to withdraw. And then the enlistments are up, which means the army goes home, which means the plan to conquer Canada failed. So sorry, no Canada to trade the king, and no Canada with more volunteers. And it turns out the French Quebec Canadians wouldn't be very happy fighting for these Americans anyway, because after all, basically these Americans are still British to them. But nevertheless, plan to capture Canada failed. That brings us to the biggest battle of 1775, Bunker Hill. So General Gage has been trapped in Boston ever since April of 1775, ever since Lexington and Concord. His 4,000 troops have been trapped inside. He's been waiting reinforcements. The colonial militias on the outside. In fact, George Washington, actually hasn't gotten there at this point. He's been affirmed and voted in as commander-in-chief, but he's still on his way. So the militia units are still training around Boston. And eventually the British get another 1,000 men or so. And along with 1,000 men, they get like 3 more generals. I mean, just what you need. So now Gage has General Burgoyne and General Howe and General Clinton to help him plan. Of course, that's sort of like having 4 football coaches in the room, or 5 school administrators in the room, or 4 or 5 political leaders in the room. They start to argue, in other words, about what to do, about the best plan. Everyone has their plan. So one of the generals has a plan he believes will work, and his plan is basically twofold. Basically, the American army, if you look at the map, there's sort of like a island that's connected to the mainland by a small narrow neck. That island is Boston. It's the city sort of colored in gray. And then if you look at where the island attaches to the mainland, you see some red. So that red is where the Americans are. That's where the main American army is. It's basically surrounding the British. It's basically forcing them to stay in Boston. So General Howe has a great plan, he thinks. He's going to row his troops over to the Charleston shore. And the Charleston shore is up above. It's to the north of Boston. It's sort of where the yellowish areas are, which represents hills. There he's going to capture that area in one day, and then move his army out through that peninsula, come back around to the little town that you see by the river, sort of halfway to Boston, then capture that town, come back around, and then he'll be behind the American army. So basically, he's going to take half the British army in Boston and basically come up from behind the American army. Then he'll attack from the rear, while the other half of the British army in Boston will attack the Americans from the front. And the American militias will then be caught between two fine British armies and crushed and destroyed. So altogether, this plan will, require the troops to be gone for about 3 days, and that's his plan. But before he can put his plan into effect, the Americans start moving troops into the Charleston Peninsula, the hilly area north of Boston. And the Americans have orders to build a little fortification on Breed's Hill, which is the biggest hill. Unfortunately, for some reason, they built it on Bunker Hill, which is the smaller hill near Boston. So as they start to build this, there's nothing there. And then one night, all these American troops arrive, several thousand start digging. The next morning, the British ships look up, and there's like a little fort being built. So naturally, the British ships try to shell it. They try to take their cannons and blow it up. Unfortunately, the hill is so high and the ships are in the water and so close that when their guns try to shoot the hill, the cannonballs land just in front of where the Americans are building. And then the cannonballs roll down the hill. And in fact, the American soldiers building the little fort, they're having such fun when the cannonballs land, they run out and catch, they roll out, they jump out from their little trenches, they jump out, they run after the cannonball after it's hit, and as the cannonball's rolling down the hill, they basically take it and bring it back and say, look, I captured a cannonball. So that's all well and good until one of those soldiers is out chasing one of those cannonballs, and a British cannon fires and takes his head clean off. At that point, the rest of the Americans decide that that game is no fun anymore, and they keep working on their trenches. So General Howe in Boston says, we're going to have to take these primitive forts out by troops, by army troops. And so Howe decides to take half the army, row over, again, he'll capture the forts, move out, capture the little sort of the headquarters cities the Americans are using, and come up from behind the American army. So he takes 2,500 men, he arrives, he lines them up. So on either side of the hills are a beach. On one side of the hill, closer to Boston, the city of Charleston basically takes up that beach. On the other side, to the north, there's a beach, but the Americans have built sort of like a wall made of hay bales and other things. And as the British Army lands, people in the city of Charleston start shooting at them with their rifles, at which point the British Navy not only starts shooting cannonballs at the city, they shoot red-hot cannonballs. They try to fire the cities, it's called. They try to burn it up, and it works. Pretty soon Charleston is burning up. But that means basically the British soldiers can't march down Charleston and get around the hill. Of course, they can march down the sandy beach towards that wall on the other side, but marching down a sandy beach and trying to maintain an army in step is really hard. So that means basically they have to charge up the hill against these American troops who are basically in a ditch, basically with their head and rifle stuck up, ready to shoot you as you come up. But nevertheless, with 2,500 troops, General Howe proceeds. And so the first attack, the troops start to march up. And as they march up, they march 100 yards and 80 yards and 70 yards and 60 yards and 50 yards and 40 yards. And they're wondering why the Americans aren't firing. Of course, the Americans are low on gunpowder. And so they've been told, don't shoot until they're about 20 or 30 yards away, which is basically 20 yards away. It's basically where you can see the whites of a person's eye. So the story gets started that they're told, don't shoot until you can see the whites of their eyes or something like that. But that's really not what really happened, probably. But nevertheless, when the soldiers get to about 20 yards, every American just opens fires. One, bam, 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 bam. And of course, many British troops fall dead. But that's okay, because they know what happens next. The American troops have to stop and reload their muskets. And that will give the British soldiers time to move forward. So the first British soldiers that fall dead, the second line just simply steps over their bodies and keeps on marching. But instead of reloading, bam, 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 and nothing, it's more like bam, 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 bam. The Americans fire all the time. But how can this be, the British Army? No, they can't fight. They have to stop and reload, but we're dying. Run away, run away. So the British soldiers run down the hill out of range of the musket, which is generally about 50 yards at the time. Of course, what had happened was the Americans were low on gunpowder. They're not low on guns. They basically brought all their guns with them. And just like today, many Americans own more than one gun. And so they had these musket rifles lined up, maybe 5 or 6 of them all lined up beside each person. And so one person would take a musket fire, take another musket fire, take another musket fire, so they didn't actually have to stop and reload. Ah, those clever Americans, so practical. Nevertheless, General Howe orders another attack. Hey, they have to be getting low on gunpowder now. And again, the soldiers march 90 yards away from the Americans, 80 yards, 70 yards, 60 yards, 50 yards, 40 yards, 30 yards, and then this continual gunfire starts again. And this time, Howe looks around, and within about 40 yards of him, he says, there's no one left standing. Everybody else is like shot down and dead or wounded. So the British soldiers run down off the hill. So this time, Howe brings his reinforcements, the last ones that he has, and this time the British soldiers take off their heavy backpacks. You have to remember the soldiers have been going to be out for 3 days. After this battle, there's going to be a couple more battles they have to fight, so they've come prepared. So they have these heavy backpacks on with extra food and extra ammunition, all that stuff. And he orders them to take the backpacks off. And of course, with the backpacks off, they can walk much more quicker than they could. So now the British soldiers start up the hill much quicker, but still about 30 yards away. Bam, 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 bam. And then the gunpowder starts to run out. And then the British soldiers know what to do. They lower their weapons with those long bayonets, those long knives on them, and they start to charge in those ditches and start bayoneting those Americans. Some of those Americans fight and die right there. Some of the rest of them throw their guns away and run back to Breed's Hill, which has another 1,000 Americans on it, also in ditches. But when those 1,000 Americans look down on Bunker Hill and see their fellow Americans getting bayoneted, knifed with these big long knives, the 1,000 Americans on Breed's Hills, they don't even fire a shot. They just run away too. And so by the end of the day, the British have secured a victory. They have won a victory at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Not by going around on the beaches, because they couldn't, but by going up the hill against heavy American fire. They have the entire area under their control. It's a great British victory. Yay! Or maybe not. The Battle of Bunker Hill results in heavy British casualties. A lot of British casualties. Of the about 2,400 British soldiers that took part that day, about 40% of them are dead or wounded. Small-scale armies today simply couldn't absorb that many casualties. So if you're Howe and you try to go on, oh, sure, you fight the next battle and you lose 40% more of your men. Then you fight the next battle and you lose 40%. Oh, wait, never mind. There won't be another battle because you'll have no men left. And so it's not really a British victory. It's an American victory. The British have taken control of this ground, but they've paid a very heavy price for it. And eventually the British just simply withdraw back into Boston, hoping for more reinforcements or hoping for another plan. So that plan did not work very well. That brings us to 1776. And by early 1776, the blockade of Boston is still in effect. The British troops are still trapped in Boston. They can't get out the neck. And now, unfortunately for them, those heavy cannons that have been drugged by hand by people like Frank Knox and Benedict Arnold all the way from Fort Ticonderoga have arrived in near Boston. Those cannons are placed on some high places south of Boston called Dorchester Heights. And from those places, those high hills, the cannons can hit places in Boston, but even more importantly, those cannons can blow up British ships, British warships and British cargo ships in the harbor. And you have to remember, the British Army is being supplied by the British cargo ships. Because they're blockaded in Boston, they're not getting any food from anybody in the colonies. All that food and ammunition and all that other stuff is being shipped from Britain, 3,500 miles away. And now those cargo ships can be sunk. And so now basically the British Army has a choice. They can stay in Boston and probably starve to death and die or surrender, or they can get on their ships while they can and get away. And in early 1776, the British get on their ships and sail away. So the British gave up and left Boston in early 1776. But the Empire will strike back. Dun, 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 dun. Well, not that empire, but the British Empire will strike back, that is.